Welcome to Schloss Leopoldskron and this Salzburg Global Seminar session on basic education. My guests are Marian Wright Edelman, founder and president of the Children's Defense Fund, Ritzen, professor at Maastricht University and former Minister of Education, Culture and Science of the Netherlands, and Betty Mould-Iddrisu, Minister of Education in Ghana. And I'd like to begin by getting a definition of basic education. The title theme of the session is Basic Education up to age 18, but I gather that in Ghana very few children are still in school at the age of 18. So how would you define basic education?
Well, basic education is defined in our constitution, and it's essentially, we've had a policy since 1992 that children should be able to go to school on a compulsory, free, universal, basic, free, up till they exit junior high school. If you go to school at the proper age, which is P1 is 6 years old, you should then exit school, junior high school at 15, into any of the other choices. But we have a problem with overaged children entering into school at a later age than 7 because of, developmental circumstances where they're sometimes doing labor, child labor, or parents not willing to let them go to school at that age. So we have all sorts of issues there.
What is the situation in the United States and Europe?
Well, I approach it, she says the right things in the sense also of looking at it from a legal perspective. And that's very much the rights to education. I very much look at it, and that's something which is happening more and more in Europe, from the perspective of what you learn. And basic education to me is really having the chance to, but also more than a chance, bringing youngsters to the point where they have opportunities in life, where they can participate on the labor market and can participate in further education. And that has had a very interesting translation in the Netherlands in the sense that if you become unemployed and you have not completed a degree, then you compulsory have to complete your degree. So this is a condition of Social Security. So actually also it's a kind of a new right that you can complete during a period of unemployment, your education.
Well, in the United States, we don't have a federal constitution right, constitutional right to education. I think that should change. 50 states set the framework of what they define as basic education. The majority of those states require young people to go to school until 18, and they have different starting ages as well, from 5, 6 to 7. Some states go up to age 17, and some actually go to age 16. And there are reasons why children can leave school at an earlier age, whether it's to work or parental decision is that they should not go to school. So it's a mishmash. But about 39 states have now subscribed to the new federal education goals in order to get the new Race to the Top money. And that is defined as K to 12th grade. Now, the only problem is that they've ascribed to that, but only 10 states, which is that first important step, kindergarten, only 10 states provide full kindergarten. And so the Children's Defense Fund is in the middle of saying, hey, the first step is really very broken. And if you want children to get off to a good start, we've got to have required high quality kindergarten in every state, and that's a very big issue for us now. I happen to feel, though, that we want in the United States, as I think we should, guarantee every child an even playing field. We have got to do more in the early childhood area. We now know that dropouts really start in those early years, and we don't yet have a high-quality early childhood system for children 0 to 3, even though we know that's the basic areas of rapid brain development. And for pre-kindergarten, we don't have universal pre-K. It's up to the states to decide, and then we don't have K. And so I think we've got to talk about what must we do to get every child ready for school, and then what must we do to ensure that every child has a school that is ready with high expectations to educate them so that they can graduate from high school.
How is effectiveness of education measured? What are the benchmarks for success in educational achievement?
Well, it should not be, I think anyway, it should not be entry into a tertiary university. This is into a tertiary institution. This is what we've been trying to change over in Africa, because we find that less than 10% of those who started primary one are able to enter, are able to continue to a tertiary institution. There should be more options. We should look, especially in Africa, where we need to develop our technologies in consonance with our own national development. We should be able to look at having relevant curricula which supply the needs of African countries. For example, in my own country, Ghana, we've just discovered oil. We're now, exploiting petroleum. And we just don't have enough qualified technicians to man the oil industry, and this I believe should come about from a very early age, where you are given options in life, and it's not all about going to university. And I was eager to find out, in America, is the education free and compulsory up to the age of 18?
Well, it is not. In some states, it's free and compulsory up to age 17. In some states, it's free and compulsory up to age 16. But then I found in our earlier surveys, when we first got started, that a lot of things are not free, and that a lot of children were dropping out of school because they had school fees for different kinds of things. And so if you lived up in rural Kentucky, up in the hollows, and you were very poor, the school bus didn't have to go up and get you. Or if you were in Maine, where we had a very high non-enrollment rate, they charged for transportation to the nearest junior high schools, even though the states would reimburse you. So, their school books were being charged for in Kentucky, and when you got into 8th grade, the parents didn't have the money and were too proud to beg. And so you had very high dropouts. So there are lots of ways in which education isn't free, but we've been challenging those barriers. And I happen to believe a child is a child is a child, and that every child, wherever they live, should not be subject to the geography of the lottery of geography as to whether they're going to have a chance to get educated. So I would like to see us define and have a federal right to education for certain basic human rights, and I think education has to be one, as well as for things like health care. But right now, the 50 states determine what a child is going to get and how prepared they are to grow up and succeed.
So that is very much the European perspective. I think in that respect, I very much appreciate what happens in Europe, where I found that increasingly also we have an idea of what counts in terms of these opportunities to be effective in society, and first and foremost on the labor market. There is not much of a contrast, in my view, between what the labor market demands and what, say, the democratic rights for you as a citizen demand. And then you notice that the cognitive aspects are extremely important. They are absolutely not sufficient, but they are very important. And that's where I like the project International Student Achievement as measuring performance. And what I've realized is that you see that those who do not perform well, we have now enough experience with that because this runs already from 1996, year 2000 onwards, that those who did not so well, who are among the first two of the 7, say, brackets in PISA achievement, Project International Student Achievement, are also in danger on the labor market, find it hard to find work, find it hard to continue education, find it hard anyway in life. So I would very much like to see far more emphasis on avoiding that part and looking at very much at the distribution, where anyway Europe does quite well compared to many other parts of the world, but still I think should remain engaged and also should avoid the way in which I realize in the US that the system is split up not as much within public, also within public, but particularly between public and private. If you are rich nowadays in the UK, you send your child to a private school. something like almost 90% of the admissions to Cambridge come from 5 private schools which cater for 0.1% of the population. I think that is a serious threat to social mobility in the country, and that definitely is not in line with the notion that you should avoid, wherever possible, should do the utmost to avoid that children end up with a, say, inadequate education.
And I want to just add that our public funding system, quite apart from rich states give more money, some of them, and poor states give less money, but our federal funding streams, let me just go back to the states again, because they're basically based on property taxes. And again, and on the wealth of the state, and each district you have highly inequitable funding between states, within states, and within school districts for the wealthy and for the non-wealthy because of the property taxes. And the role of the federal government, which was a big debate, but which finally came about through the Elementary and Secondary Education Act in the 70s, was designed to try to promote more equity because poor children were not being treated fairly, except that the funding formula for that has never yet been equal. And that's one of the issues that we have been fighting about for 35 years. And it's coming up for reauthorization, and we're out there saying, but the federal government's role is to make sure that there is fairer funding, and yet we have unfair funding within school districts, and so there is an effort by the Obama administration to say you've got to calculate correctly, make comparable what they get within a district as a precondition of federal funding. But then within the districts in a state, you will see vastly different qualities of education, and between states, you will see vastly different things. And so one of our struggles is to make sure that the federal role does not reinforce and widen inequities, but closes them. Yep. And just to get back to your original question, if I'm remembering it correctly, I think that children should be able to do what they need to do in order to have a decent living in this country. If they are able to go to university because of their abilities, they should be prepared to do that. If they're strong vocational or other things, but they ought to be able to make a living in this economy and to be prepared for an economy where it's changing, rapidly all the time. But how do we prepare children to be able to live and succeed and contribute in this very complicated globalizing economy? And the United States, again, and I think it's our great Achilles heel, is failing to educate a majority of its children to do basic reading in 4th grade, 8th grade, and 12th grade. A majority of all of our children in all racial and income groups cannot read or compute in these grades. And for minority children who are going to be a majority, children of color are going to be a majority in 8 years, in 2019, 80% of our Black and our Latina, and over that for our Native American children, cannot read or compute at grade level in 4th, 8th, or 12th grade, which means that they're being sentenced to social and economic death, and their dropout rates are about 40%, and they're at risk of what I call the cradle to prison pipeline. Yep. And it's a resegregation device. It's a very big danger point, but who is going to be that labor force if you are not educating a majority of your children?
So that creates for me, I think, a point of hope. The latter part. I don't see social mobility any longer as only as a social issue. I think for me it's really an economic issue. If we are not realizing our talents, we simply are not going to do well. I'm still surprised about the US, how well the US has done, actually to a large extent by immigration. I mean, you have 3 deficits. You have the deficit, of course, in terms of trade, the deficit in terms of government debt, but also in human capital. So in terms of the scientists, the engineers, they come from abroad. And at some point that's going to stop. So in that respect, you need to do the best. I would also go one step further in terms of looking at equal access to good education. That can often mean actually paying more in children who live in poor neighborhoods per student. So that's actually what I did as a minister. We instituted the point, we said always, the schools in the worst neighborhoods should be the best schools in order to make sure that you have the compensation there, because they don't get from their home background what they need. So this was actually a major, major political fight because the middle class doesn't like that.
Not like that at all. And this was the point of our elementary and secondary education and our federal role. The problem then became one of what the funding formula was, and secondly, how you enforced it. And the first report we ever did, we went through all the federal audit reports, and we found that, and we asked the question, is Title I, this compensatory education program designed to help poor children, is it really helping poor children? Yeah. And we found that the money was going to everybody except poor children. Yeah. And so we've had a 35 or 40-year effort to enforce it, and that is still the basic issue. The funding is not fair between rich and poor districts and within districts, and secondly, it is poorly enforced and implemented. But you're right, it has to be giving extra. But right now, they don't even get the even, and that's what we've got to change.
What about the family? Parents in determining what sort of education children will have. And in the absence of functioning family structures, whose responsibility is it to educate those children?
If I can talk about our condition in Africa, that is the reason why we had to make education compulsory, because the generation before us just were not educated. We have in Ghana an illiteracy rate of almost 40%. And this, if you have 40% of the population, the adult population, who have not been to school before and who cannot read or write, what then happens to the children? And yet there's the aspirational, i.e. they want their children to go to school because they believe with the children being in school, they will have a chance at a fairer life. But they want the governments to provide the resources for that, which is fair enough, because in order to achieve social mobility, especially for those of us who are developing and transiting to middle-income countries, we need the governments to provide a level playing field for the children. However, there are all kinds of disparities, and I'm getting back to what you both were talking about earlier. I have a passion for gender and for the inequalities in gender, and this is it's masked a lot by the national statistics, and it's something that we are looking at seriously in not only in Ghana, in most of the African countries. You have to look beyond the national statistics and go into the basics and see where the gender disparities are coming from. The national statistics tend to mask the fact that there are huge gender disparities in areas of endemic poverty, and that those therefore need targeted, specific, focused interventions. And it's something that I think that we need to do more of in Africa. And I don't think that you have that problem in Europe and in America. Oh, yes, you do in America with the African,
and we aspire not to.
Boys.
One of the good things that happened in the last reauthorization of this Compensatory Education Act is that they did begin to make transparent and disaggregate data by race and by income, so that we can now look and see, rather than having the overall figures of achievement, we can now look and see the different groups and how well they're doing, and are able now to begin to, at least with outside advocacy groups and others, to say, here's how we've got to correct it. Children don't come in pieces. And so this false argument that we often have, is it the parents, is it poverty, is it schools, it's all of them, plus neighborhoods, and plus the values of the community and the states and the federal government. All of these, I think, impact what the children learn. We get the poorest children with the greatest needs tend to get the least experienced teachers, to have the least resources, to have the poorest laboratories, the poorest libraries. It should be the other way around. You know, they should be getting the best because they've got so much more to overcome, and that's a part of the struggle that we have got to overcome. I love my country so deeply, and I'm convinced that the human capital deficit is our greatest national security problem. But, you know, we have always aspired to be an equal a society that said everybody has certain inalienable rights, and we fall short, but we are still struggling to be America. And that, you know, we have a history of slavery. And after slavery, we have a history of trying to begin to, rigid segregation and apartheid. And then we went through a civil rights movement, so we are able to begin to transform ourselves, and we were trying to fight unequal but separate schooling. And then now the implications of the last 30, 40 years since Brown versus Board of Education, last 60 years, has been to try to figure out how we can have separate but equal, which we don't have, and we're resegregating, and how we can overcome what I consider that basic birth defect of slavery and then rigid apartheid, and we're just all struggling to see if America can become America. But that does require that we've got to see that all of our children are able to have that level playing field.
There's a very important point to be made here, and that is actually the willingness of people to be taxed. So this is very much related to this question. So I could easily say Europe is in a great state compared to Ghana or to the US, and when you look at everything in terms of figures. But when you look at the development of figures, then you notice that Europe is becoming slightly Americanized step by step. So the impact of parents on the education of the children has always been tremendously large. But the compensatory impact of the school has been increasing since the generations of 1945. But then that stops somewhere around the generations of 1980, children born in 1980. Also in Europe, you notice now that gradually the impact of parental income on achievement of children statistically is increasing. It's actually, to a large extent, the new mixture in Europe. Immigration, children will come from outside who don't have the parental backing in terms of learning, the normal parental backing which there used to be, the school not able to deal with it, the school also becoming far less qualified in terms of the teachers. The teachers used to be the leaders in society. My father was a teacher, and he was the leader in the neighborhood. For everything, they came to him because he was recognized as the person who understood the world. And he was one of the very few who did this. Now the teacher is no longer, also for my father, it was an equal career of becoming a businessman or becoming a leader in society in other ways. Now that is no longer the case. A teacher is someone who is maybe somewhat less qualified. The teacher profession is no longer looked at. And it has a lot to do with payment. It has to do with training, but it's, at the end, it's also really payment of the teacher. And payment is very much the willingness to tax. And here in Europe, we have also seen that we have followed the US. We said also, Reagan was the man who said, lower taxes, lower taxation leads to higher taxes. Ridiculous. Of course, it never happened. It meant just less social services. In Europe also, we have been decreasing taxes. And at the end, the question really is, to what extent are we willing to tax ourselves? Having been a minister, I had a fight day by day with the Minister of Finance, because he always said, you're so expensive, your budget is so large. It's by far the largest budget, of course. In any of the European countries, it's much larger than defense or other budgets. And at the same time, it's too small in order to be able to continue to pay teachers on a level which is comparable to similar positions in society. So I think there is something really at stake to be discussed here.
Well, you have partly answered what was my final question, and that is on the quality of education and the importance of good teachers. How do you make a good teacher? Is it the training? You've mentioned the remuneration, the financial incentive, perhaps the working conditions, or maybe natural aptitude. How do we make good teachers?
In Africa, we make them with training. It's true, all that you were saying could have been applicable to our own countries, where the education ministry, generally speaking, in the 53 African countries would be the largest. And we definitely take the largest share. We take almost 30% of the country's budget. And we pour huge resources into education, into paying the teachers. It's never enough. And the teachers, the quality of teaching has declined considerably. We don't have the numbers of trained teachers. We still have the pupil teacher syndrome. I don't know if you have that anywhere in Europe or America, where teachers are, where they're untrained and they go into the classrooms just to fill space. You have situations where 10%, they're saying that 10% of, it's only 10% of the children in P3 and 6 who are tested who can read and write, you know, English and do maths in a functional way. So for me, the policies in Africa must be teacher-centered. They need to revolve around the teacher in order to get each child an equitable access to some sort of education. You need to have a teacher in the classroom. You need to cut down on the problem we have with contact hours with the children. You need to have time on task visibly improved. Right now it's running at 40% in my country and quite a few other African countries as well. And this is not only due to the remuneration, but it's due to the poor infrastructure, especially in the remote and underserved communities that teachers find themselves in. So they leave the classrooms, they go back to school without permission. They also need to be socially mobile, because teaching in Africa, unfortunately, has become the second option. If you can't get into university to do X, Y, or Z, then, well, you go into a teacher training college. That is not desirable. That is not what teaching is and should be about. And it is this that we seek to redress now by coming out with specific interventions in teacher education, by having continuous education for teachers, by providing them more opportunities, not only in terms of remuneration, but in terms of incentives to go out into the underserved communities and to be able to do what it is our children need. They need to be in a classroom from 8 to 2 p.m. and they need to be taught by a teacher, and that's not what we're getting.
Well, I'm very much involved in a project towards the elections for the European Union in 2014, where I very much plead for a radical change. I don't believe anymore in continuity. And a radical change has to start actually with a different view on society and a different distribution of income. So I make the connection between the two. Our distribution of income is very much like that in the US, more inequality. We accept the strange phenomenon that the top 10% of the income distribution gets still more and more of the total pie. It's now in the order of magnitude of some 40 to 50%. In the US, it's actually up to now some 60%. This is not the right way to go. So I plead very much for a political platform to say we should limit the differences in income, which means also that you have more room for taxation. It can be done through taxation or through other ways. That money is available in education. And in education, it would be very important to see this as the major thrust, in my view, of society. And everything starts with education. If you do well in education, you prevent the costs of crime. You prevent the costs of health. You prevent the costs of all kinds of other costs. And in that respect, I believe that indeed you should invest the money there. I don't see it anymore, once again, as a small change, as doing something, one intervention at a time. It has to be done radically in order to create a different perspective for the career. We also have the same problem. We do not attract the best and the brightest anymore because they don't see a career. They don't see a career as leaders. So if they have the leader capacity, they go somewhere else. So we should change that around.
I think we made a major transformation in how we define success. In America, we do have the highest recorded wealth and income gap that we've ever had. You see a lot of noise now, which I think is good, about the 1% versus the 99%. We've had this massive redistribution from everybody at the bottom of the 99% up to the top 1%. Only 25 of our top hedge fund managers in America have the equivalent earnings of 22 states' income. That's just wrong. We have the highest child poverty rates, which are going up, and we've got to deal with the fact that we now have 16.5 million poor children. 7.5 million of those children are in extreme poverty, and the younger our children are, the poorer they are. That's disgraceful. We have focused in on our, we've got to reevaluate the status of education, and we've got to redefine education and investment in children as our greatest national security issue. We're going to go backwards in America, and our mobility is going backwards. Our children are not going to do as well as we did if we don't change course. But we've got to define our national security in terms of our human investment and our values professing to be what we say. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, whom I quote in almost every speech, the great Protestant German theologian who died opposing Hitler's Holocaust, believed that the test of the morality, and I would say common sense of a society, is how it treats its children. And the United States of America, which has been blessed with so much, and again, I think we are still the greatest country in the world, but we won't be. But we're flunking Bonhoeffer's test every hour of every day that we let a child drop out of school, every 9 seconds. I mean, I never get used to these. I say it all the time. Grow up, be born into poverty every 32 seconds. Go without health insurance. Be born without health insurance every 42 seconds. We have a child killed by a gun every 3 hours. We have a child abused or neglected every 42 seconds. These are the figures of our downfall. We have got to begin to do what Europe has done and invest preventively in the early years. We don't yet have the same kind of access to health care and early childhood development that most of the European countries have, and why should we be struggling to do that? And we know the seats. And I'm not proud that we are way down in the 20s and sometimes next to the bottom in some basic child indicators, though we're number 1 in incarceration rates, with the black boy having a 1 in 3 chance of going to prison in his lifetime, a 1 in 6 chance for a Latino boy. We're spending 3 times more in our states per prisoner on average than per pupil. That's really a dumb investment policy, and it is contrary to our values of an equal chance for everybody. So we've got to come to grips with whether we're going to move back towards trying to get America to be America, whether we're going to really tackle child poverty. We could end child poverty. Dr. King dying, calling for an end to child poverty.
This is not a minor change.
It's a transformation. This has to be a major change.
It's important to say that the education question is not one which is separate from other social questions or from the way we have organized our societies.
Precisely.
But we have simply done the wrong thing. So I was a minister, I saw it happening, and I didn't realize to what extent I would see this back some 10 years later in figures. And now I say, please look at the figures and make sure that we are not going down the drain. I would say, sometimes we say, we are not going to go the American way. We are going to restructure ourselves. But also, that would be very radical. And in a way, I'm quite interested to see whether we can get a political platform. This is not something for an individual European country. This is something which we have to do for Europe as a whole. And I think we will have a chance. We have a chance to talk about this, as I can find from also people in business do realize this. They have never actually been called to the test. Well, and when I say to them, but it does mean that your income also will have to decrease, they say, well, I don't like it, but I think it is necessary. So in that respect, I do believe there is a momentum when we take it. And I very much look at your inspiration. We have to take it by a movement. We have to make the point and make it consistently, and we have to build up a constituency. And then I think we can make the change.
Well, I think that this is one of those inflection points in history. I think that we're seeing the churning going on and the desire for a new world order. Our young people want to see more democracy. Radical means roots. It means really, but we're in a different place now. I mean, we cannot continue to build more weapons of death. I mean, the United States spends more in its military than all the other nations of the world combined. You know, I think we could, Barney Frank, who follows these things pretty, one of our most smartest congresspersons, who was about to step down, who said, you know, we can do away with $200 billion in our military budget, and we put that into health care for our children and education and job development. You know, we've got to rethink what is our national security. It's our people, it's our children. Yep. And we're being killed from within because of this failure of fair sacrifice. But this is a moment of opportunity. And I think that after 40 years of trying to kind of, please invest in your children. Children are not responsible. What have we brought them here? It is a time now when I think that we have a chance to, we can't get there from here incrementally. You know, we're constantly eroding. We've got to make a big jump into a different kind of review of who we are as a people and what we want to be in a world that has got to move toward justice and peace if we're going to be secure.
And in a way, we have a huge constituency, which is for the Netherlands, something like 10% of the voting population has something to do with education, as a teacher or a parent or as in school. So in that respect, it should be easy to mobilize this. But I think one of the things which I realize has gone wrong is that education has become so much a separate sector, and has not been very much part of society at large, and has not had, when I talk to the Minister of Finance, in their memoirs, they write always very negatively about me. They found me such a bad person because I kept claiming money, and they said, we have so little money. And the point always was, he was not under pressure from a community which said to him, you serve this guy, you make sure that education gets the right place. So I think building up that constituency, which is there, but building it up in terms of making it a strong constituency which claims its rights, that would be very important.
And Betty, as a current Minister of Education, does this all sound very familiar?
Well, it does, but in another way, because education for us is about life. You know, it's life-changing for us in Africa, not only individually, family, but the continent, our country and the continent. It can change us. We believe it can take us out of where we are and propel us into a completely different world. We have also these big demands, but there is a vociferous community that supports much more being done for education, that demands quality education, that demands equity, that demands access, and that demands good teachers. So we have that, you know, very much going for us. What we don't have is the couple of $100 billion that you were talking about.
Well, we do not have a money problem in the United States or in many of our other places. We have a values and a priorities problem, and that's why we've got to build a movement to change it. And education is about having enough to eat. It is about having a place to sleep and not being homeless wherever we are. Exactly. We cannot have a world, and we're one world now, and I think our borders are porous, where we have, what is my figure, my mind, 1,290 billionaires and millionaires, 1,290 people in this world have an income or a wealth equivalent to 2 billion people. That's not fair. You cannot have a stable, peaceful, just world with the levels of poverty and illiteracy and unclean water. We're at this point. I think we have to decide how we're going to move forward together.
Well, I think that if you give Ghana your 200 billion,
we have our Ghana in our country, but we can share with Ghana. We have enough to share too.
Ghana has this great opportunity with oil, but it's also an opportunity with tremendous risks. Because when you look at the way in which natural resources have been used, it's quite often a very small group which profits. And it actually leads easily to income inequality and less equality of opportunity. Russia is is really the point to be made there. Russia really has neglected its education, has had at one point so much oil that they actually couldn't digest it. But it led to some 40,000 people who became billionaires. who buy clubs in the United Kingdom, who spend money lavishly around the world, but not on education. So I think natural wealth is something which requires a tremendous, I would say, control and discipline. Now, this is a lady to whom I believe she's going to do this. She's going to make sure that this money is used in the right way.
I will try my very best to do that.
I don't want to end on a pessimistic note. We can change this. We can, we must. We have got to deal with our environment. But the point is that we have leadership and we have people and citizens' voices. And it's always a few determined people who bring about a transforming change. So everybody's just got to decide they're going to take responsibility and just begin to do it. And we've seen remarkable change in our lifetime. I mean, who would have thought that the Soviet Union would have crumbled? Who would have thought about the Berlin Wall crumbling? Who would have thought that racial apartheid would fall in America, even though we've got to finish it all now? Who would, you know, there have been extraordinary changes that came about because enough people demanded it. And it doesn't have to be everybody, but I think that we now have to step up to this new task of how to...
And we have also had people like you and others who've participated in this seminar who are very passionate and very committed.
Yes.
So I think that we can end on that happy note. And I'd like to thank you, Marian,
Yes.
Jo, and Betty.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.